We've all seen at least one TMZ headline of a celebrity checking themselves into rehab for sex addiction. When I first heard about this, the idea felt really foreign, like, that must be a California thing, until a friend's husband cheated on her and he was diagnosed. My next guest found his interest in sex addiction in college, but it's not like it sounds. He attended a Christian university where there was an intense focus on preventing and curing porn addiction. There were talks, support groups, accountability partners, and yet something didn't feel right to him. He noticed all the addicts seemed to also function well enough to keep their grades and jobs. That's when he started to apply research methodology to the issue. He's since published over 100 papers on the topic, and today we're going to explore the question, is sex addiction real? Addiction researcher, unserious scientist, Southern dude who uses PhD words, Dr. Joshua Grubbs.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. I got that last bit from your Twitter account. Hope that was okay.
Yes, no, it's a good description. That's a good description.
Well, is it weird that I am really, really excited to talk about this from a research point of view?
I know. I think it's a topic that a lot of people are interested in. And so, I think it's kind of natural. I mean, you're preaching to the choir, so to speak, when you say you're excited. I mean, yes, I've invested, 12, longer than that now, close to 13, 14 years into researching this topic. And so, yeah, I think it's exciting, but I think the public is excited too. I mean, sex is part of what makes, mammals, but certainly humans. And so, when it goes kind of sideways or goes wrong, I think there's a lot of natural interest in that.
Well, great. Well, then let's let our nerd flags fly. I'd love to kick it off with a definition, because I heard you say in another interview that dependence itself is not an indicator of addiction. And I guess I thought from my non-researcher perspective, that was the definition of addiction.
Yeah. So dependence is not required for something to be addictive. Now, many addictive things or many addictions do feature dependence. So opioids, heroin, oxy, that type of thing. That's the classic example of the body develops a strong physiological dependence that leads to craving that's inescapable. Alcohol's the same way. Nicotine's the same way. So cigarettes or vapes or things like that. But there's other drugs that don't create necessarily dependence that in the same way that we do consider addiction. So you could have a marijuana use disorder, but physiologically you can't be dependent on THC or marijuana. Cocaine does not have the same type of dependence that you actually see in heroin or other opioids. And then there's substances that not all of us, but many of us are quite dependent on that we would never call an addiction. So caffeine is the classic example there. You can drink a lot of caffeine or consume a lot of caffeine to a point that if you stop using it, you'll have withdrawals, you'll crave it, but it's not interfering with your life or creating problems in a way that it's necessarily an addiction. So dependence is one of those things we often see in addiction, but it's not required. And that matters a lot, right, when we're talking about behavioral addictions, because as it turns out, you cannot be physiologically dependent on sex, so to speak.
Interesting. So is it a clear definition between physical and mental addiction?
I don't know that I would say anything in definitions in science are clear.
True. I think, spoken like a true researcher.
I do think that the physical components of a disorder versus the psychological or psychiatric components are often distinct, but then again, there is also overlap. So being physically dependent on a substance leads to craving, which is your desire, your body wanting it. But the translation of your body saying, I want this, to you saying, this is the thing I want, there's a whole mental process that's involved with that. At least from my perspective, I think that the physical bleeds into the mental, which then bleeds back into the physical. And that's just who we are. We aren't minds with bodies, and we aren't bodies with minds. We're both, right? And they both feed into each other.
That's very true. I think the mind-body separation overall, as a perspective towards wellness, it's becoming more integrated, like we're realizing that those two systems are not insular from each other necessarily. So yeah, I could see that. When did the sex diagnosis become a thing, sex addiction diagnosis?
Well, and so there's a long history here, right? Like you can go back to Greek mythology. and see examples of sex crazed gods or heroes or villains or whatever. And so I think for most of human history, there's this idea that humans can become out of control and excessive in their sexual behavior. It was kind of talked about a little bit in the 1800s, early 1900s, with some of the early founding fathers of psychiatry and clinical psychology. But it really wasn't until the late 70s and early 1980s that it started being talked about as a mental health diagnosis. And so in the late 70s, it was called more hypersexuality. In the early 80s, there was a practicing therapist, psychologist by the name of Patrick Carnes that coined the term sex addiction, who wrote a book that was very influential at the time. But it wasn't until 2018, 20, it's a little confusing. So it wasn't until 2018 that a formal diagnosis for sex addiction was proposed and then ultimately included in a diagnostic manual. So although we've known about this idea for decades or centuries, really, it's wasn't until the World Health Organization was looking to revise the International Classification of Diseases. Lots of big words. It's the guidebook for all diseases that they recognize. And in developing that, someone proposed, well, it was proposed to include compulsive sexual behavior disorder. In 2019, they voted to include it. And now it didn't actually go live until January of this year. So January of 2022. So the official diagnosis of compulsive sexual behavior disorder, to be able to diagnose someone more or less with what we might call a sex addiction, has only existed for 11 months.
Wow, I didn't realize that as far as being in the diagnostic manual, it was that fresh. Like the ink is barely dry.
That's certainly true. There was an attempt to get it in the DSM, which anybody that follows American psychiatry and psychology is familiar with the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. There was an attempt back in 2009 to get a disorder called hypersexual disorder, but it was outright rejected, not included at all. So this is, I mean, it really is, the ink is barely dry on this new diagnosis. And a lot of us are scrambling, playing catch up with trying to make sure that the science supports what clinicians are out there working with.
Yeah, that's an important detail. It seems like again, it would be a little fuzzy, much like the definition of pornography. It wasn't long ago that I was going down a research rabbit trail for my podcast, as one does, and learning about the history of prostitution. And it seems like porn, prostitution, and sex addiction, they're all, tangled up in each other. They're like that Christmas ornament you pull out of the box and it's got all the hooks and the stuff all attached. It's hard to undo. And because the definition of obscene material of porn was so subjective. The other thing that's subjective that I wanted to ask you about related to that is how different is habituation to sexual behavior and porn? Is it habituation or is it addiction? Because like with porn, for example, you hear people say anecdotally, oh, I watched soft porn and then that didn't do it. And then it became escalated into more violent porn, for example. So is there a difference between habituation and addiction when it comes to sex addicts?
I think so, because I think that there's a more clear explanation for why we see people jumping around porn genres than saying, oh, it's habituation and tolerance. So habituation and tolerance are the things that we get thrown out a lot. It's the same idea that, well, like if you're consistently, using opioids, you have to use more and more to get the same high. Porn, I think, is more based on the very well demonstrated tendency that humans prefer sexual novelty. And so that's, a kind of obtuse way of saying people like new stuff when it comes to sex. Humans, and it's not just humans, but many mammalian species in general, like the prospect of having multiple partners, like the prospect of trying new things. Like novelty is something that we are kind of hardwired to seek out. And so shifting what you're looking at from a pornography perspective is probably more a function of that. And I do think it's worth noting that although a lot of people shift genres around, I don't know that shifting genres of porn or looking at different things or being into different things is inevitably always going the harder route. So you hear about that, but sometimes people are into one genre and then they shift to a different genre. And it's not any harder or less hard. It's just different. And that's satisfying the novelty piece as well. And so I think the novelty component is more important necessarily than habituation or tolerance would be.
And so how does that relate to sex addiction? Do people become habituated to, certain frequency or certain exploits, right? And then is it the same thing? It doesn't necessarily indicate addiction, or is it different and it actually does lead to more addictive behaviors?
So, I mean, I think that the seeking out of novelty and trying to kind of shift things up and shake things up is quite different from sex addiction. I think that piece of it is very human. It's very normal. It's why there's a million and one different advice columns explaining how monogamous couples can spice things up in the bedroom. It's
Right.
the same idea, right? Where
Yeah.
you're trying to get novelty reintroduced into something that's become very familiar. Among those that are dealing with compulsive or excessive pornography viewing, it's certainly possible that the novelty seeking has spiraled out of control. I'm also I tend to be a little more curious in those situations about what the pornography seeking, the viewing, the time that's spent doing that is providing outside of the sexual behavior itself. So there's often this focus on like, well, what are you viewing? And to be clear, if you're viewing illegal materials or child pornography or things like that, that's a whole different kind of ballgame. But barring that, I'm more interested in what function it's serving in the person's life than I am on whether or not they feel like they're escalating or not. I think that there's this piece of they're viewing pornography quite regularly to avoid something, to cope with something, to deal with something, and that whether they're involved in just watching standard heterosexual, romantic oriented pornography versus, group sex and things like that, or even some more intense stuff, that's probably going to be less important than understanding what's leading them to the pornography in the first place.
Interesting. This conversation is sounding a lot like my conversation that I had with a woman who calls herself a sober scientist. And we talked about alcoholism and how you kind of self-identify if your alcohol is a problem or not. It's a very personal thing, and your motives really matter. It's so fascinating. I want to know the difference between you're just a cheater and you have a sex addiction, because as I said in the intro, I know someone whose husband fooled around with a girl and now he has regular counseling and his diagnosis is sex addiction. Now, we aren't that close of friends, so I wasn't able to ask follow-up questions. I didn't feel comfortable, like, has he exhibited displays of this behavior prior? It wasn't my place. But can you kind of illustrate the difference between the two?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a million different reasons that an episode of infidelity can happen, and that sex addiction or compulsive sexual behavior disorder, if you will, would be one and a somewhat unlikely one at that. And what I mean by that is, people have affairs. They are unfaithful for all sorts of reasons. It could be unmet emotional needs in a relationship. It could be unmet physical needs in a relationship. It could be the desire for novelty that I was just describing and feeling like there's no path forward for that in the relationship. And the list could go on.
Yeah, you could just be a douche canoosh. Like, it doesn't have to be like
right. I mean, and so the idea that, I did this just because I had a sex addiction, I don't know the situation, but especially if it was only one affair, I'd be extraordinarily skeptical that that's what's going on. The cases that have seen that I'm more familiar with of people that are exhibiting more of those potential compulsive sexual behavior disorder tendencies are, partners that are having strings of affairs or soliciting sex workers excessively, or finding themselves, spending 2-3 hours a day viewing pornography locked away from their partner or things like that. And even in those situations, I think it still has to be approached with caution and making sure that it's truly a dysregulated sexual behavior that's the problem versus, well, you're using that sex behavior to avoid other stuff.
right, as a convenient
Yeah, and
diagnosis.
so in general, I tend to be very skeptical when the diagnosis of sex addiction shows up at a very convenient moment to excuse behavior that might otherwise seem intolerable, right? So Tiger Woods going into sex addiction rehab because, he was sex addicted, and it got found out, right? Yes, he had an extreme number of partners. I'm not sure that I think addiction is the right framing for that. I don't know. He's not my client, so I can't say that he doesn't. But it's interesting that that's the moment that brings it to light when everything becomes public. And there's multiple celebrities that fit that bill, right? That have gotten caught with dozens of affairs, and this
Yeah.
seems to be the way out of it. And it may be just as simple where they're very rich, powerful, most often men who were fully availing themselves of all of the access to sex that provided. And then when they got caught, they decided to claim it was a disorder so that they could escape some of the responsibility for their actions.
I mean, that's a pretty human sounding scenario. Kanye West, right? Are we even having a conversation about mental health if he doesn't get brought up?
Right.
He said quite a few years ago that he had a sex addiction. And so this brings up another thought regarding that. Is it possible that for, let's just say, someone with bipolar disorder, not sure if that's his deal, but let's just say someone who has bipolar disorder and has huge swings of ups and downs and unsafe behavior, sexual exploits maybe is a part of that sexual behavior. Wouldn't it be inaccurate to diagnose them as a sex addict because that is an acute symptom of a bigger problem?
Right. So hypersexual behavior is a very common feature of bipolar disorder. It's not even rare. Like that is one of the things that as a therapist we look for. Have you had those swings where you were excessively sexual? And that is a rule out for diagnosing compulsive sexual behavior disorder or for any of the other previous ideas around the diagnosis, because at that point it is a symptom. It's the same way of saying we wouldn't say that the person that went on a shopping spree and went $30,000 in debt while they were manic was dealing with compulsive shopping behavior all the time. We would say, well, they were manic and they made a decision when they were manic. So if the excessive sexual behavior is only occurring in the presence of a manic episode, of that upswing of bipolar, it is not considered CSBD. It's considered, compulsive sexual behavior secondary to a bipolar episode.
Okay, interesting. And what about OCD? Because people who hyperfocus or obsess, as the name implies, they would obsess in behaviors like we all think of hand washing for some reason. For some reason, that's like the first example we all think of. But certainly we wouldn't call that like a hand washing addict. It would be a symptom of OCD. Is OCD kind of in that realm with sex addicts, or is that a completely separate thing because sex addiction is so specialized and large, it deserves its own diagnosis?
So that would depend on which scientist you were talking about. Some
Oh,
scientists do subscribe to the notion that sex addiction is in the same constellation as obsessive compulsive disorders are, and that it's a type of obsessive mental fixation, and the compulsion is the sexual behavior. I
okay.
think the evidence in support of that is not as strong as a more addiction model. So there's basically three camps in my world, maybe three and a half. So there's the OCD model, which is what I just described. There's the addiction model, that it's a true addiction, just like any other addiction. There's the impulse control disorder model, which is very hard to define because in psychiatry and psychology, clinical psychology, impulse control disorders are kind of this catch-all for you. You don't know how to stop doing the thing you're doing. And so it doesn't really fit. I mean, other impulse control disorders are things like kleptomania or pyromania. And so if you think about compulsive sexual behavior, it doesn't quite seem the same as kleptomania and pyromania, but some do view it in the same part. And then the kind of half, maybe fourth camp is that there is a very small subset of people that view kind of all compulsive sexual behaviors as a trauma response. The data do not support that, but there are some folks that believe that. And then I'm kind of on the outside of saying, well, these are all interesting models. I don't know which one's right. I'm more interested in why people think they have a sex addiction than I am on how we accurately classify the exact, features of the disorder, so to speak.
And why is it more common with sex addiction for people to prefer to self-report themselves as a sex addict than, say, something else, like just
Right.
a cheater?
Right. Well, so there's a lot of reasons that I think that could come up. I mean, one of the really fascinating things about compulsive sexual behavior disorder, about sex addiction, if you will, is that it may be the only addiction where people show up to therapy saying they think they have this, and then it's the therapist's job to decide whether or not they actually do. And what I mean by that is, I can't recall ever working with a client that says, well, I think I have an opioid addiction. And then they come in and it turns out they don't use opioids. Or come in and say, well, I think I might be an alcoholic. And then you ask them, when do they drink? And they're like, well, I drink, once a month and I have 2 drinks at that point in time. Right. That's not a scenario we see. But with
Sure.
sex addiction, we have people coming in and saying it with some regularity. And sometimes it's in response to being caught in an affair. Sometimes it's in response to a spouse or girlfriend or boyfriend in some cases, catching them viewing porn regularly. In some cases, it's not in response to anything, but when you get into the nitty gritty of the sexual behavior, it's infrequent. It's relatively normal, and it doesn't seem to be interfering with their life other than the mental energy and emotional energy they're spending on it. And what we find is that sex in particular is wrapped up in people's sense of morality. And as it turns out, when you're doing something that violates what your moral foundations are, what your moral kind of code is, that creates feelings of, the term we use is incongruence. There's this misalignment of like what you believe is right and what you should be doing and what you're actually doing. And that disconnect, that dissonance leads people to feel guilt and shame and kind of just torn up inside, for lack of a better words. And they often interpret it as an addiction. And so it's often easier to say, well, I must have an addiction because I keep doing this thing that I believe is morally wrong, than it is to say, maybe my beliefs about this are unrealistically strict.
That explains so much. That is really interesting. We'll talk about some signs that people may have a sex addiction in a second, but you were talking about the studies, you were alluding to the kind of the studies that you've done. I think I heard you say you've done hundreds, like over 400 individual studies, or, reviewed them. Can you give an example of what you would consider a classic case of sex addiction, where it wasn't a scapegoat, it wasn't a case of moral incongruence, but it was, textbook?
Right. And so I'll give two examples because I think they look a little bit different, that are both classic kind of ones. So I think the very easy to point out classic example would be the person who is consistently and excessively seeking out new sexual partners. This is often, it is more common for this category to be either men who have sex with men or women. Heterosexual men can't often find sexual partners quite as easily. And so excessively seeking out new sexual partners, like multiple partners a week kind of thing, just approaching it in a reckless way and doing it especially in response to anything that promotes kind of negative emotions in themselves as well. So it's this constantly seeking out sexual encounters with other people.
But what is constant? Can you give like an example of a real person that without, obviously disclosing who they are?
I mean, I can think of cases where people were averaging, 5 to 12 new sexual partners a week. And
that sounds like a part-time job. I mean,
yeah, well, exactly. So there's this time component to it, right? That is important. So like, if you're hooking up with a couple of new people a week, but it's in a setting that it's not consuming a ton of time and you're approaching it in a safe way, and it's not getting in the way of you performing, your job, any other relationships that matter to you. Let's say you're in an open relationship and that's fine with you and your partner. I'm not going to diagnose that as a sex addiction, but if it's, 5 to 12 new partners a week, it's getting in the way of your work, it's getting in the way of your other social relationships, you're blowing off friends or other important people because you're trying to go hook up with somebody else. That's a point where you start to say, hey, something's not quite right here. Something's getting in the way. So that partnered sexual behavior is one of them. I think the other kind of classic example that we see more and more of now is internet pornography, but it's the person that's either viewing multiple hours a day every day, or the person that's trying their hardest not to view at all, but then goes on like a 12 or 14-hour binge twice a week, skips work, gets fired, gets caught viewing porn at work, gets fired. Supposed to pick the kids up from school instead of staying home viewing porn, creates marital problems. Partner catches them multiple times, that type of thing. And so I think the time component, the time invested in both the mental part of it, the preparing to find sexual partners, as well as the time invested in the sexual behavior itself, are the key kind of components that we're looking for, because it needs to be enough that that itself is interfering with your life, that it's getting in the way of you doing the things that you need to get done. So, I mean, if you do find that porn is getting in the way of you keeping a job or keeping a relationship, and it's based on how much time you're spending doing it, that's a pretty big red flag that maybe you should talk to somebody about what's going on.
Okay, so as far as signs that a person may have a legitimate case of sex addiction in which they would benefit greatly from getting outside help, would be what you said, if the time invested in doing whatever it is that they're doing, whether it's virtual or in person, is interfering with, in a negative way, with their other relationships or their employment.
Or their employment, right? Or other things that matter to them. So like if you're the type of person that truly loves, so maybe this is a very idiosyncratic example, like I truly love freshwater angling, fishing. I like going fishing. It's what I do. There's all sorts of reasons. But if you say that's like your favorite hobby, but for whatever reason you find, okay, well, I haven't done that in months because I've been spending all my time seeking out sex, that's also a pretty big red flag, right? Like if you're replacing things that you value. So those things that you value could be hobbies, but it work, relationships that matter, things like that.
What are some other signs that someone listening may benefit from knowing about, to either self-diagnose or maybe kind of suss out a partner?
Suss out a partner, right? So that, with a lot of addictive behaviors, we often say, well, is there secrecy involved? Because that's typically a big red flag. That's a little less true for sexual behaviors,
because it's a private thing.
Right, it's a private thing, and then there's partner pieces that are involved with that there. So if you find yourself, though, engaging in a sexual behavior over and over again, even though you don't enjoy it anymore, that's a big red flag as well. So something that is pretty classically seen among people that have true compulsive sexual behavior disorder, or true sexual addiction, if you will, is that they find themselves drawn to the behavior even when they don't subjectively report enjoying it that much anymore. And in fact, afterwards, can say, well, I didn't enjoy that at all because the guilt and the shame is so, I screwed up again. I can read off of the quite literal criteria. I do have those open. But if you find yourself trying to cut back on the behavior repeatedly and you can't, so you're using it a lot of time, you're trying to use it less time doing it. It's trying to spend less time doing it, and you just can't make it less time. That's a red flag. And does it feel like the sexuality, in particular, the sexual behavior, has become the central focus of your life to the point that you're neglecting other things? And so not just the time that you're spent doing the activity, but even your free time is like obsessed and fixated on it in a way that you don't have the mental space to think about the other things that matter as much in your life.
So it really is about the why pretty heavily, like why you're engaging in it.
That's a huge part, yes.
Okay, that's really interesting. Have you come across any successful recovery stories?
Yeah, I mean, there's dozens that you can find in the literature. I can point to many examples from my kind of clinical work as well. So recovery, it certainly happens. And recovery is a little bit weird, though, with compulsive sexual behavior in particular. It's not the same as, say, opioids, where we can say, well, the goal is that you never use opioids again, right?
Right.
A sexual abstinence is not the therapeutic goal in compulsive sexual behavior disorder, because humans are sexual creatures. By and large, we are sexual creatures. Removing that component from a person's existence is removing a part of what really makes us who we are. There are extreme cases where maybe that is something that somebody wants to pursue, But just in general, we denying sexual urges altogether is not something that I would generally say is healthy. So the solution for, unhealthy sexual behavior in a lot of situations is healthy sexual behavior. So it is about finding what are the parameters of sexual behavior that work for you. And so does that mean, I mean, and what does that look like can vary quite substantially. So if someone finds they're engaging in excessive sexual behaviors that are unsafe with partners, unsafe sex leading to sexually transmitted infections, for them learning to, practice safe sex, maybe spend less time seeking out new partners, and maybe use porn more but partners less, that actually could be a healthy type of recovery for that person. Whereas for other people, it may be about, well, I try not to view pornography because it doesn't work for me in my relationship in my life currently. And instead, my partner and I have been really working through couples therapy or even couples sex therapy to develop a vibrant and healthy sexual dynamic between the two of us so that we both feel like our needs are being met.
Is there like a, I don't know if this is a stupid question, but is there like a 1-800 number? I was just thinking like, okay, someone's listening to this right now and they're like, oh my gosh, I might have a problem. They might want like an in-between step between listening to this and then like signing themselves up for therapy or rehab. Like, is there like a hotline they can call to talk with a mental health professional where that professional could say, let's help you find someone local that you can speak with?
For sex addiction specifically, there's not really that same type of resource. Unfortunately, it's because it's so new as a diagnosis that we're still kind of building those networks. And I would be very cautious about the information you find on the internet because, I can point to some therapists on the internet that would say sex addiction is never a thing. It could never be a thing. It is not real. It's just something else. And then I could point to other therapists that are saying, oh, yes, you viewed porn once last month. You have a porn addiction. Here's how you can never view porn again. And that's also not maybe the help you. And so there's a lot of kind of mess and bad information out there. I think some of the resources collected, there's a society known as SASH, which is Society for the Advancement of Sexual Health. They have some resources that are quite good. I have with porn in particular, there is a therapist who has a lot of his materials available online. His name is Cameron Staley. That's Staley, who has a lot of resources about taking what we call an acceptance and commitment approach to working through excessive porn use that I think is really, really, it's a healthy way of doing it. So it's not about saying I have an addiction, I must never do this again. It's about accepting who you are and working towards living the way that you want to live without, hating yourself in the process. But right now, the resources are kind of piecemeal. And I mean, that's one of the big objectives we have over the coming years is that if you Google sex addiction therapist, you can find one in your area, but I would be very skeptical of whether or not you're going to find a good one. And so when I say building an evidence basis to match what therapists are doing or to help therapists with what they're doing, like that's one of the big goals that researchers in the space are hoping for is that we can say 5 years from now, here's how you treat this. And if the therapist you're seeing doesn't offer this, find a new therapist.
Yeah, let's hope. This has been such a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much. Can you close us out by telling people where they can find you on social media, website, that sort of thing?
Yeah, so my website is joshuagrubbsphd.com. So that's just my first name, last name, phd.com. For the time being, I'm still on Twitter at Joshua Grubbs PhD as well. Who knows? There's a lot going on in the social media world, so who knows how long that will last. And I am a faculty member at Bowling Green State University in Ohio. We have a doctoral program in clinical psychology. So if you're interested in the very academic side of what I do, you can Google my name in Bowling Green State University, and that'll all come up.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hey, you're still here. Thanks for watching. If you love breaking free from the algorithm to explore curiosity, join me each week by hitting subscribe and the bell for new upload notifications.